In the year 612 AD, the skies of Northeast Asia were choked with dust. 1.13 million combat troops, and a total of 3 million including the logistics train, the largest war machine in human history, began to grind forward with a single chilling purpose: to erase one nation from the map. Is the Liao River wider than the Yangtze? With a single official, I could replace your king at my whim. This was the arrogant ultimatum of the Sui emperor, the man who had unified the vast continent after centuries of chaos. But even before this razor-sharp threat, Goguryeo remained silent. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the lethal stillness before a brewing storm. The Battle of Salsu, a massacre so absolute that only 2,700 men out of 300,000 returned alive. Why did the Sui Empire, the self-proclaimed masters of the world, crumble against the iron wall of Goguryeo? Today, we uncover the records of a 70-year war that shattered imperial pride and rewrote the destiny of Northeast Asia. This is the story of a legendary victory.
In the year 589 AD, Emperor Wen of Sui, Yang Jian, annihilated the Chun dynasty of the south. This monumental event brought a definitive end to more than 300 years of fragmented chaos that had persisted since the Wei, Jin, and northern and southern dynasties. This was not merely a change of regimes. It signified that all human and material resources of the entire continent were now integrated under a single, absolute command structure. Goguryeo, which had reigned as the hegemon of Northeast Asia by expanding its power while the Central Plains were divided, now found itself sharing a border with a unified empire dozens of times larger than itself. As soon as the news of the Sui unification reached the court of Goguryeo, an intuitive sense of crisis took hold. We are next. Driven by this realization, the entire nation began transitioning into a total wartime footing.
Goguryeo, which had reigned as the hegemon of Northeast Asia by expanding its power while the Central Plains were divided, now found itself sharing a border with a unified empire dozens of times larger than itself. As soon as the news of the Sui unification reached the court of Goguryeo, an intuitive sense of crisis took hold. We are next. Driven by this realization, the entire nation began transitioning into a total wartime footing. The Sui dynasty promoted a unipolar worldview, asserting that they were the sole center of the world and that all surrounding nations must become their subjects, or vassal states. To them, Goguryeo was the final obstacle that had to be brought to its knees. In contrast, Goguryeo was a powerful state with its own independent worldview, believing itself to be the center of the universe. They used their own era names and exercised authority over neighboring tribes like the Mohe and Khitan. Goguryeo's insistence on maintaining an equal relationship with the Sui, from the Sui's perspective, an intolerable act of insolence that could not be overlooked. At that time, the Gokturks, the masters of the northern steppes, were the most formidable threat to the Sui dynasty. To keep the Sui in check, Goguryeo engaged in secret alliances and diplomatic contacts with the Turks, effectively aiming a dagger at the Sui's back. The Sui dynasty lived in extreme fear of a north-south alliance between Goguryeo and the Turks. They were haunted by the terrifying possibility that if Goguryeo and the Turks joined forces to attack the Central Plains, even the unified Sui Empire might not survive. This paralyzing fear drove them toward the decision to launch a preemptive conquest of Goguryeo. In this volatile climate, Liaodong was the critical gateway for the Central Plains to move northeast, and simultaneously, the shield with which Goguryeo blocked the Central Plains. Hegemony over all of Northeast Asia depended entirely on who occupied this land. Furthermore, Liaodong was a vital source of high-quality iron ore and a breeding ground for the superior horses needed to raise a powerful cavalry. The Sui dynasty sought to complete the perfection of their empire by seizing Liaodong, the very source of Goguryeo's formidable military might. During this period of heightening tension,
Emperor Wen of Sui dispatched an official royal letter, known as a seiso, an imperial decree, to King Fengwan of Goguryeo. This was no mere diplomatic correspondence. It took the form of a strict order issued by a superior to a subordinate. Emperor Wen defined Goguryeu's independent military activities, conducted without Sui's permission, as a direct defiance of the empire. He specifically took issue with the fact that Goguryeo had recruited Nusu, expert crossbowmen and technicians, from the Sui dynasty. This was a sharp warning, revealing that the emperor had seen through Goguryeu's preparations for war, specifically their efforts to adopt the Sui's advanced weaponry systems. Emperor Wen exerted immense pressure on Goguryeo by explicitly recounting how he had annihilated the Chen dynasty of the south. His words were a direct mockery of Goguryeu's geographic defenses. Even the treacherous Yangtze River could not stop my great army. No matter how wide the Liao River may be, could it possibly compare to the Yangtze? And no matter how many soldiers Goguryeo has, could they possibly outnumber the forces of the Chen dynasty? By declaring, if I so desire, I could replace the king of Goguryeo by sending a single low-ranking official, the emperor fundamentally denied the legitimacy of the Goguryeo royalty. It was an open declaration that he regarded Goguryeo not as a sovereign state, but as a mere local province of the Sui Empire.
The Sui dynasty refused to tolerate Goguryeu's influence over the Mohe and Khitan tribes as vassal states. Emperor Wen accused Goguryeo of inciting these tribes to raid the Sui borders and commanded that Goguryeo immediately renounce all influence over them. For Goguryeo, incorporating these northern tribes was not just about territorial expansion, it was a core national survival strategy through alliances with nomadic forces. The Sui's demand was a blatant attempt to sever Goguryeu's arms and legs and leave the nation completely isolated. When this letter arrived at the fortress of Pyongyang, the Goguryeo court fell into a chilling silence. However, this was not the silence of fear. Recognizing that the empire's arrogant demands had crossed a line, the officials and the royal family of Goguryeo instinctively knew that the time had come to answer not with words, but with swords. In the year 590 AD, King Yongyang ascended to the throne, succeeding King Pyongyang. While he inherited his predecessor's prudence, he was also a leader of fierce resolve, believing that any challenge to Goguryeu's sovereignty must be met with a merciless counterstrike. Upon his coronation, under the banner of "A war of self-respect is better than a humiliating peace," he formalized the confrontation with the Sui dynasty and replaced the military leadership with young, spirited commanders. King Yongyang foresaw that the Sui, riding the momentum of their unified empire, would soon launch an invasion. He looked beyond mere defensive measures like raising city walls. He commanded sophisticated tactical and intelligence warfare to identify the enemy's movements first and disrupt their very footsteps. In the single year of 591 AD, King Yongyang dispatched envoys to the Sui twice, maintaining an uncharacteristically humble diplomatic stance. The Sui Empire interpreted this as a signal of Goguryeu's submission and let their guard down. In reality, however, these envoys were a group of licensed spies composed of Goguryeu's top geographic tacticians and intelligence officers. They traveled freely within the Sui capital, meticulously recording the locations of military bases, the scale of grain storehouses, and even the width and depth of newly constructed canals. Most crucially, they obtained the decisive intelligence that the Sui were building a massive fleet on the Shandong Peninsula, specifically for the conquest of Liaodong, and reported this back to Pyongyang. After the Goguryeo envoys returned, Emperor Wen belatedly realized that they had not merely offered tribute, but had thoroughly scouted every corner of the empire, and he was consumed with rage. He dismissed the Goguryeo envoys as literate thieves and grew wary, but Goguryeo had already identified the Sui's troop movement routes and the vulnerabilities in their logistics. Based on the information brought back by these spies, Goguryeo completed a detailed military map of the entire Sui territory.
This later became the foundational data that caused the massive Sui army to become isolated and crumble amid Liaodong's rugged terrain and Goguryeu's scorched earth and logistics disruption tactics. While the intelligence war was underway, the legendary Gamma Musa, armored cavalry, within Goguryeo entered rigorous training. These warriors who clad both horse and rider in heavy steel armor were Goguryeu's ultimate weapon designed to crush the infantry legions of the continent. The people of Liaodong moved into the fortresses of their own accord to prepare for the siege, and mountain fortresses were packed with enough grain to last for years. On the surface, a quiet peace seemed to hold, but all of Goguryeo was pulled taut like a giant bowstring. Now King Yangyang was waiting for only one thing: the perfect moment for a preemptive strike to seize the initiative from the enemy.
In 597 AD, the final group of envoys returning from the Sui dynasty presented a shocking report to King Yangyang. Emperor Wen was already constructing massive grain storehouses near the Liao River, and fleets destined for a direct assault on Pyongyang were gathering at the naval bases of the Shandong Peninsula. Among the court officials, a fierce debate erupted between the moderates, who argued for sending more envoys to apologize and buy time, and the hardliners, who insisted on confronting the enemy immediately. It was then that King Yangyang drew his sword and declared, "The enemy is sharpening their blades at our throats. Shall we merely prostrate ourselves and beg? Before the enemy completes their preparations, we shall strike at their very heart." Breaking the conventional wisdom that war typically begins in spring or summer, King Yangyang issued the order to march in the bitter cold of February 598. 10,000 elite armored cavalry, Gamma Musa, personally led by the king, along with highly mobile Mohe units, crossed the frozen Liao River and advanced into western Liao, Yaoshi, the territory of the Sui.
Goguryeu's objective was clear: Yingzhou, the core logistical hub where the Sui were amassing all supplies and troops for their conquest of Liaodong. Striking this location was a sophisticated strategic choice intended to paralyze the Sui's very capacity to wage war. The Sui garrison never imagined that the Goguryeo army would cross the border and attack. As the gates were breached and the Gamma Musa charged in, Yingzhou instantly descended into chaos. The Goguryeo cavalry, with both man and horse encased in heavy steel armor, tore through the Sui infantry lines like they were made of paper. Goguryeo forces burned the Sui's military storehouses and annihilated the forward-deployed troops. This was not a mere raid for plunder. It was a precision strike that completely derailed the Sui's planned conquest schedule.
To the Sui dynasty, which was intoxicated by the momentum of unifying the Central Plains, the news that Yingzhou had been scorched was like a bolt from the blue. While the Sui believed they were the sole center of the world, Goguryeo had instead crossed the Liao River first to strike at the empire's throat. This victory was about more than just seizing land. It proved to the Khitan, the Mohe, and the Gok Turks, who had all been warily watching the Sui, that the Sui Empire can also be defeated. The Goguryeo shock that swept across the continent shook the very foundations of the unipolar order the Sui were attempting to build. The Goguryeo army systematically destroyed the military warehouses and means of transport in the Yingzhou area. This forced the Sui to delay their planned large-scale expedition by at least several months, and became the decisive reason why the Sui army struggled with supply issues throughout the duration of the war. Upon receiving the report of the defeat at Yingzhou, Emperor Wen of Sui was consumed by an extreme, blinding rage. He declared, "A tiny nation dares to cast a stone into the vast ocean. I shall show them exactly what the price of such insolence is," and immediately proclaimed an all-out war. Emperor Wen appointed his fourth son, Yang Liang, the Prince of Han, as the commander-in-chief and mobilized a massive force of 300,000 combat soldiers. He established a total offensive system to pressure Goguryeo from both the east and west, mobilizing not only the land army, but also a naval force led by Zhou Luohu. In June 598 AD, the Sui army of 300,000 crossed Linyu Pass and marched toward Liaodong. The line of supply wagons stretched beyond the horizon, and the roars of the soldiers shook the very earth. The confidence of the empire that had unified the Central Plains once again pierced the heavens. However, this was precisely what Goguryeo had intended. By launching the preemptive strike on Liaodong, Goguryeo had successfully maneuvered the massive Sui army to move to a time and place of Goguryeo's choosing. Under the cold, fierce command of Emperor Wen, the 300,000-strong army marched gallantly toward the Liao River, headed for a clash of unprecedented proportions. This marked the official beginning of a 70-year war that would stake the destinies of two empires, Goguryeo and Sui. Beyond the plains of Liaodong, the colossal war machine of the Sui Empire began its fateful movement.
In June 598 AD, the moment the 300,000-strong Sui army crossed Linyu Pass and set foot on Goguryeo territory, the heavens opened with a record-breaking torrential downpour. The soil of Liaodong had a unique characteristic. When saturated with water, it transformed into a vast, bottomless swamp. Tens of thousands of horses and soldiers became trapped in the mud, unable to move even a single step forward. The most fatal blow was to their logistics. With the supply base at Yingzhou already destroyed by King Yongyang's preemptive strike, the grain wagons struggling up from the Central Plains were completely cut off by the storms. Wheels shattered, oxen and horses collapsed from exhaustion, and the grain intended to feed 300,000 men rotted in the rain. The Sui camp fell into such a wretched state that men began to say, "Hunger arrived before we ever saw the enemy." In Feldin monsoon season, pestilence began to spread among the malnourished and weakened soldiers. In a battlefield devoid of any sanitation, disease proved to be a weapon more terrifying than the sword. As comrades who walked side by side one day were found as corpses the next morning, the morale of the Sui army plummeted to rock bottom.
The Goguryeo army did not force a full-scale frontal confrontation. Instead, they employed guerrilla tactics, using the wind and rain as cover to launch lightning raids specifically on the Sui supply units before vanishing. To the Sui soldiers, the Goguryeo warriors were like ghosts of the forest. Harassed by the constant sound of hoofbeats every night, the Sui army suffered through an agonizing war of attrition that left them without a moment of sleep. While the land army was embroiled in a muddy struggle in Liaodong, the Sui navy, led by Zhou Luohu, departed from the Shandong Peninsula toward Pyongyang. They intended to seize Pyongyang before the land forces to end the war quickly, but the violent gales of the West Sea blocked their path. Massive warships collided and shattered against each other in the fierce storm, and soldiers who lost their balance were hurled into the freezing sea. Seizing this opportunity, the Goguryeo navy appeared, using their superior knowledge of the local geography to crush the chaotic Sui fleet. The Grand Armada, carrying the ambitions of the Sui emperor, vanished into the depths of the West Sea without ever catching a glimpse of Pyongyang.
Prince Yang Liang, the commander-in-chief, finally had to make a desperate decision. Although they had never truly engaged in a proper battle with the main Goguryeo force, more than 80% of his army was diseased, starving, and had lost all combat capability. With a scream of, "If we stay here, we all perish," the 300,000-strong army began its retreat. Goguryeo did not leave the fleeing enemy in peace. The Gema Musa, armored cavalry, pursued them relentlessly, cutting off retreat routes and driving them hard. The Sui soldiers discarded their weapons and begged for their lives as they scrambled back across the Liao River. According to records, those who managed to cross the river back to the Central Plains accounted for a mere 10 to 20% of the original force. When Emperor Wen saw the haggard and broken state of Yang Liang upon his return to Chang'an, he was struck with profound shock. The dignity of the Son of Heaven who unified the Central Plains was trampled into the mud of Liaodong. Until the day he died, Emperor Wen was left with a trauma so deep he could never again bring himself to utter the name Goguryeo.
Yang Guang, the second son of Emperor Wen, ascended the throne amidst dark suspicions of assassinating his father and ousting his elder brother. This was Emperor Yang of Sui. He dreamed of a monumental empire that would surpass mere unification and bring the entire world to its knees. He viewed the disastrous defeat his father suffered in Liaodong as both a personal family disgrace and a stain on the empire's prestige.
Upon his coronation, Emperor Yang intensified projects that bled the common people dry, including the construction of the Grand Canal and the building of magnificent palaces. To prove his absolute authority, he seized control of every resource on the continent, and his gaze was now fixed on a single target, the eastern powerhouse that had yet to bow before the empire, Goguryeo.
By the year 607 AD, the Gokturks, once masters of the northern steppes, were weakened by internal strife. In particular, Kimin Khan of the Eastern Turks was effectively a puppet of the Sui, maintaining power only through their active support and manipulation. Emperor Yang treated the northern territories as if they were his own backyard. It was there that he unexpectedly encountered figures he never anticipated, Goguryeo envoys secretly negotiating an alliance with the Turks. The Turks, who should be beneath my feet, are daring to collude with Goguryeo. Struck by a profound sense of crisis and insult, Emperor Yang felt Goguryeo was attempting to encircle the Sui Empire. He threatened the Goguryeo envoys on the spot and sent an ultimatum to King Yangyang. "Come to Chang'an immediately and kneel before me. If you do not, my great army will turn your mountains and rivers into a sea of blood." King Yangyang flatly ignored the emperor's arrogant demands. "We are not a vassal state of the Sui, and we have no reason to follow the emperor's orders." This chilling silence from Goguryeo set Emperor Yang's madness ablaze.
He immediately issued an imperial edict proclaiming the conquest of Goguryeo. A tiny nation called Goguryeo is disturbing the order of the great empire. I shall personally go and pull them by their very roots. This was not just a military expedition. He began pouring every human and material resource of the Sui state into a single purpose: the total annihilation of Goguryeo. Emperor Yang designated Zhuozhun, near modern-day Beijing, as the assembly point and operated the Grand Canal endlessly to transport supplies from the south. Millions of commoners were conscripted to pull wagons and row boats. Though corpses of those who starved to death piled up along the roads, the emperor did not stop. Every day the banners of new units arrived at the plains of Zhuozhun: infantry from the central plains, cavalry from the western regions, and archers from the south. Emperor Yang drove every man in the empire toward the battlefield to reach the staggering number of 1.13 million. This was no longer just war preparation. It was the prelude to a colossal catastrophe designed to erase Goguryeo from existence. Emperor Yang of Sui went beyond merely gathering soldiers. He remodeled the entire Sui state into a colossal war machine dedicated solely to the destruction of Goguryeo. Declaring, "I will not stop until Goguryeo is erased from the map," he concentrated every human and material resource of the empire toward the northern border. In every forge across the country, the sound of sharpening arrowheads and hammering armor never ceased, day or night. Through the Grand Canal, the abundant grain of the Jiangnan region was pulled continuously to the north. In this process, millions of conscripted commoners collapsed from hunger and overwork, their bodies lining the roads.
By January 612 AD, the plains of Zhuozhun, near modern-day Beijing, had transformed into a vast sea of men and horses. The records show 1,133,800 regular combat troops alone. When including the Minbu, civilians, responsible for logistics, transport, and labor, the number easily exceeded 2 million. Effectively, every adult male in the Central Plains had been driven toward Liaodong. Not only were there native Sui troops, but also cavalry from the western regions, archers from the south, and even mercenary forces from conquered ethnic groups. Emperor Yang bestowed upon them magnificent banners and armor decorated with gold and silver, flaunting the empire's prestige. The spectacle was as grand and overwhelming as a war fought by the gods themselves. It took a staggering 40 days for this massive army to simply depart from their base. By the time the first unit arrived at the Liaodever, the final unit had not even begun to leave Zhuozhun. The procession of soldiers stretched across 960 li, approximately 400 kilometers. The dust they kicked up obscured the sun even at high noon,
and the sound of their marching boots was like an earthquake shaking the very foundations of the earth. Emperor Yang presided over this grand host from a massive mobile palace, clad in golden armor and flanked by the elite 36 armies. He was certain of victory. The moment my great army sets foot in Liaodong, the walls of Goguryeo will be torn like paper. His hubris pierced the heavens.
In the spring of 612 AD, after crossing the Liao River, Emperor Yang of Sui finally confronted Liaodong Fortress, the linchpin of Goguryeo defense. As the 1.13 million-strong army surrounded the castle in layer upon layer, the plains outside became an endless sea of Sui banners and armor. Emperor Yang was brimming with confidence, declaring, "Now that the armies of the world are gathered here, the people of Goguryeo will surely crawl out in terror of their own accord." However, Liaodong Fortress was no ordinary castle. Its walls were like giant mountains carved from rock, protected by deep moats and the collective, decades-honed fighting spirit of the Goguryeo people. The soldiers and civilians within united as one under the banner of the three-legged crow, ready to face the empire's massive tidal wave.
The Sui dynasty poured in the finest technology East Asia had to offer. Massive battering rams to crush the walls, catapults to hurl boulders, and cloud ladders, siege towers that rose as high as the ramparts themselves, battered Liaodong Fortress day and night. Fire arrows and rocks rained down from the sky like a relentless storm. Yet the Goguryeo forces did not waver. They poured boiling oil and water from the battlements to halt the enemy's approach, and under the cover of night, even the civilians joined the soldiers to rebuild the breached sections of the wall. Rumors began to circulate among the Sui troops that the walls destroyed by day rise again by morning, as the resistance of Goguryeo reached superhuman proportions. Emperor Yang issued a bizarre and counterproductive command to his generals. "If Goguryeo offers to surrender, you must never attack. You must report to me first." This was a product of his vanity. He wanted to personally receive Goguryeo's submission to bolster his own prestige. The clever commander and soldiers of Liaodong Fortress exploited this perfectly. Every time the fortress was on the verge of falling, they would shout, "We surrender," and send out envoys. While the Sui generals halted their assault to wait for the emperor's permission, the Goguryeo forces repaired the walls and replenished their defenses. The emperor's own vanity repeatedly shackled his grand army, leading to a ridiculous cycle of wasted opportunities. As months passed without overcoming a single fortress, a logistical crisis struck the 1.13 million-strong army. Immense amounts of food were consumed daily, and the resentment among the Sui soldiers pierced the heavens. Driven by impatience, Emperor Yang finally made a dangerous decision: ignore Liaodong Fortress and march directly to Pyongyang. The emperor selected 305,000 elite soldiers to form a special detachment. Each man was forced to carry 100 days' worth of rations and weaponry as they crossed the rugged Liaodong Mountains toward the capital, Pyongyang. Little did they know, they were walking straight into a colossal spiderweb spun by Goguryeo's legendary strategist, Earl G. Mundok. It was the beginning of their annihilation.
As the 305,000-man detachment crossed the Yalu River and approached the very doorstep of Pyongyang, an unprecedented tension gripped the Goguryeo court. At this critical moment, General Ulji Munduk made a radical proposal. "I will go into the enemy camp myself to observe their strengths and weaknesses." He judged that they could not stop this massive wave without first understanding the temperament of the enemy commander, Yu Zhongwen, and the actual combat readiness of the detachment. Risking the fate of Goguryeo, Ulji Munduk headed into the enemy camp alone. He posed as an envoy sent to deliver an intent to surrender, boldly walking through the ranks of the 300,000 Sui soldiers. The Sui generals were taken aback by the sudden appearance of Goguryeo's commander-in-chief, but soon, intoxicated by an arrogant sense of victory, believing Goguryeo had finally knelt before the empire, they invited him deep into the commander's tent.
While pretending to negotiate with the Sui generals, Ulji Munduk scanned every corner of the camp with keen eyes. Though they appeared majestic on the surface, the soldiers' eyes lacked vitality, and because their supplies were cut off, their hunger had reached such an extreme that they were chewing on horsehide.
Specifically, after spotting the decisive clue that the soldiers had been secretly discarding their heavy grain sacks, Ulji Munduk became certain. This army is already collapsing. Having grasped everything, Ulji Munduk remarked, "I must return so I can persuade those in the fortress who insist on fighting to the death to open the gates peacefully," and he calmly strolled out of the enemy camp. The momentary intelligence gained from the heart of the enemy became Goguryeo sharpest spear, eventually drowning the 300,000-strong army in the Salsu River.
After escaping the enemy camp, Ulji Munduk did not immediately engage in a full-scale battle. Instead, he employed the 7 defeats tactic, purposefully losing 7 times in a day. Blinded by their victories, the Sui generals Yu Zhongwen and Yu Wenshu believed the Goguryeo army was fleeing in terror and pushed their exhausted soldiers to march recklessly all the way to the outskirts of Pyongyang. When they finally reached the fringes of Pyongyang, the Sui detachment was beyond its breaking point. Their food was gone, the fortress walls were majestic, and the Goguryeo army was not fleeing. They were perfectly arrayed and waiting for the enemy. At that moment, Ulji Munduk launched his final psychological strike to shatter the enemy's morale. He sent a poem to Yu Zhongwen through a formal envoy. "Your divine tactics have exhausted the patterns of heaven. Your subtle calculations have pierced the principles of earth. Having won the battle, your merit is already high. Why not know satisfaction and return now?" This was no praise, it was a chilling declaration of war, saying, "I have already seen through your limits, so if you do not wish to die, run away now." Upon receiving the poem, Yu Zhongwen trembled with fear, realizing that Ulji Munduk had read his every move. Ultimately, the Sioux army made the pathetic decision to retreat, with Pyongyang in their very sight.
Stricken by hunger and fear, the 305,000-strong Sui detachment fled back toward the Salsu River, modern-day Changchun River. The river appeared shallow, and the enemies hurriedly began to cross. However, this was the final chapter of the massive trap designed by Ulji Munduk, dam he had built using ox hides and stones. A wall of water as tall as a house struck the starving Sui soldiers, and the river was instantly filled with Sui banners and corpses.
Goguryo's Gema Musa, armored cavalry, and archers, who had been lying in ambush on both sides of the river, charged at the panicked enemies. Those not swept away by the river fell under Goguryo's blades. Of the 305,000 men who started the detachment, only 2,700 survived to cross the Yalu River. It was an annihilation unparalleled in the history of human warfare. Even after losing his 300,000-man detachment at Salsu, Emperor Yang did not give up. In 613 AD, he raised his forces once more to besiege Liaodong Fortress. This time, he changed his tactics. He built cloud ladders taller than the castle and constructed earthen mounds as high as the ramparts to look down and attack from above. For over 20 days and nights, the Goguryeo forces fought a desperate battle, and Liaodong Fortress stood on the brink of an absolute crisis, nearly ready to fall. Just as Liaodong Fortress was about to collapse, a catastrophic event erupted in the Sui rear. Yang Swangan, a high-ranking aristocrat responsible for military grain transport, launched a rebellion, declaring the tyrant Emperor Yang must be deposed, and threatened the Sui capital, Luoyang. To Emperor Yang, this was not just a simple revolt, it was the terrifying realization that the very foundation of his power was disintegrating.
The emperor issued an immediate retreat order with Liaodong Fortress right before his eyes. At this moment, Hu Xizheng, a close advisor to the emperor and a longtime friend of the rebel Yang Swangan, sensed danger and defected to Goguryeo. Upon learning from the defector Hu Xizheng that the Sui army was in full retreat, Goguryeo utilized this critical intelligence to strike the rear of the withdrawing Sui forces. The Sui army suffered massive casualties, with the number of fallen soldiers reached tens of thousands.
After suppressing Yang Shuanggan's rebellion, Emperor Yang proclaimed yet another expedition against Goguryeo in 614 AD. However, the empire had already reached its breaking point. Decades of relentless war and forced labor on the Grand Canal had turned the lives of the Sui people into a living hell. The young men who should have been farming were either dead or diseased in Liaodong, and those who remained became bandits in the mountains, unable to endure the crushing taxes. A tragic trend even emerged where people would intentionally sever their own hands or feet to avoid conscription, calling them blessed hands and feet.
During this third expedition, the Sui Navy managed to capture Pisa Fortress at the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula and attempted to move towards Pyongyang. However, the morale of the land forces had hit rock bottom and soldiers deserted daily. Goguryeo was also exhausted from the prolonged war. At this juncture, Goguryeo played a clever diplomatic card. Goguryeo sent back the defector Hu Sijeng and made a gesture of feigning surrender. Emperor Yang, desperate for a justification to end the war, accepted this as a true submission and hurriedly withdrew his troops. However, by the time he realized King Yongyang would never actually come to pay him homage, his empire was already being swallowed by the flames of total rebellion.
As rebel forces rose like wildfire across the nation, Emperor Yang abandoned his capital and fled to Jiangdu, modern-day Yangzhou, in the south, where he indulged in wine and hedonism. Looking in a mirror, he reportedly muttered, "Who will be the one to behead this fine head?" Ultimately, in 618 AD, he was strangled to death by his own captain of the guards, Yuan Huaji.
Emperor Yang of Sui gazed into the mirror, touching his own neck as he foresaw his impending death. The madness that drove him to devour Goguryeo ultimately became the spark that incinerated his own empire. In the end, the Sui dynasty vanished hollowly from the pages of history, lasting a mere 37 years. Why not know satisfaction and return now? This single sentence hurled by General Olji Mundok at the enemy commander was no mere mockery. It was a manifestation of Goguryeo's multipolar worldview, the fierce resolve to determine their own destiny. It was a stern warning that any invader would be forced to pay a devastating price. This was the spirit of Goguryeo, a nation that refused to bow even before the overwhelming violence of superior numbers. They did not settle for the passive defense of locking their gates. They showed the world the decisive courage to cross the Liao River first and strike at the enemy's very heart. Today, the victory of Goguryeo is far more than just a story from the distant past. What kind of self-respect and strategy must we hold today, positioned as we are among giant superpowers? The winds sweeping across the plains of Liaodong are still asking us that very question.